Welcome to the concept review for Unit 5, Industrialization and Global Integrations, circa 1750 to 1900. Remember, this video references this document right here, and you can feel free to follow along as we're going through the concepts from the AP framework. This unit has four key concepts, and the first one is about industrialization and global capitalism. And here's the concepts we'll be looking at: how industrialization changed the production of goods, patterns of global trade integrating the global economy, financial institutions, developments in transportation and communication, and various responses to global capitalism, plus social classes and organization. In the industrialization category, we start with the production of goods and the rise of industrial production and what caused that to happen. And the first has to do with the location of Europe on the Atlantic Ocean, giving them access to trade routes, and also the fact that Europe had resources needed for industrialization, such as the coal and the iron shown on this map here. Additionally, Europe had a network of rivers. The main rivers are in yellow on this map. And also, because of its location on the Atlantic Ocean, access to resources in foreign areas, particularly the colonies in the Americas. And remember, after independence in the late 17 and early 1800s, Latin America, as shown on this map, develops export economies and is selling those products to Europe, but that's still a necessary cause of the Industrial Revolution. Second, we move on to the sources of energy. And remember, the factories are primarily run by the steam engine, and coal and oil are the main sources of energy for those factories. So here's that map again to remind you of the sources of coal used for the steam engine. The next change in the production of goods is the development of the factory system. You might remember this picture from a DBQ that you looked at. And the development of specialized labor of workers working in factories. And also important in this unit is the fact that industrialization spread around the world. Remember, it started in Britain, and then it moved to Europe, to Russia and the United States, and on to Japan, and eventually around the entire world. The next section deals with patterns of global trade and how they help to integrate or kind of bring together the global economy. And the first is the growth of export economy. So here's that same map again, reminding you that Latin America developed an economy that was dependent on the factory system in Europe and other industrialized parts of the world. Next, we move on to the fact that industrialized states were seeking access to new markets. One of those examples is China, of course, and this political cartoon reminds us of the various European powers trying to gain influence over China. The development of mining centers like gold and diamond mines in South Africa is another example of new patterns of global trade during this time period. The next section is about financial institutions and the importance of stock markets, of transnational businesses like the United Fruit Company, and of economic liberalism. Remember, that's the idea that there should be little government intervention and control over business, and sort of emphasizing free trade and the power of companies to pursue profit in a capitalist supply and demand competitive atmosphere. The next section is about developments in transportation and communication, and the Industrial Revolution, of course, brought railroads, steamships, telegraphs, and canals, which obviously helped industrial production and sales in terms of moving goods around the world, and also telegraphs were a key development in communication before the telephone was invented. Next, responses to global capitalism and the development of unions as a way to protect the rights of workers, and socialism as a slightly more extreme method, and the most extreme would be the development of Marxism and the suggestion that workers should overthrow the factories by force and distribute resources equally. The next response is the resistance of the Qing dynasty, shown here on this map, and the Ottoman Empire against economic change. And so you might remember from that chapter, which is chapter 19, examples such as the Boxer Rebellion, which we will come to later. And here's the Ottoman Empire. Moving on, we have some examples of state-sponsored industrialization. Here's a picture of modernization in Meiji, Japan. And also remember China's self-strengthening movement. And then we have some reforms to respond to the threat of rebellion, such as the expansion of suffrage or voting rights in Britain. And the last section in this part of the framework is about new social classes and social organization. And we have the development of the middle class and the proletariat, or the working class, which is, of course, the group that Marx emphasized that was most victimized by the process of industrialization. And finally, for this one, changes in gender roles that resulted, and the effects of urbanization on industrial societies, such as unsanitary conditions. So again, that first section of the framework is really focusing on industrialization. Concept 2 looks at imperialism and the formation of new nation states, and we'll be looking at the establishment of transoceanic empires, the influence of imperialism around the world, and the justification of the imperialist system. Starting with the establishment of transoceanic empires. The framework reminds us that some empires existed before this time period, such as the British control of India. They are down here in purple, and that those were strengthened during this time period. It also reminds us that there was a decline in the influence of some societies, especially the Portuguese and the Spanish. And if you look at this map here, this is kind of an imperialist map of Europe. And if you check the key down here, we don't have Portugal and Spain. But you might remember from Unit 4 that the Portuguese and the Spanish, having been the first ones to Asia and establishing trading post empires for a time, were kind of the dominant European power there. So this map is a reminder of the decline of those European powers. And of course we have new empires in Asia, which is the map we just looked at, and also in Africa. So these are the imperialist colonies, and don't forget the connection between industrialization and the need for raw materials and for new markets, and imperialism. There is definitely an economic motive to the establishment of these imperialist colonies. There's other types of colonies, for instance, the British establishing the settler colony in Australia. And there's also a reminder of a phenomenon called economic imperialism, which is not a political takeover, but an expanding economic influence over a country or a region. So the European influence in the Opium Wars and the unequal treaties that were signed is an example of that. And then, of course, influence in Latin America, primarily the United States. This map here shows U.S. interventions in various parts of Latin America, and those were motivated by economic desires for those resources. The next section is about the influence of imperialism around the world. And again, don't forget that the threat of U.S. intervention is what led to the establishment of the Meiji Restoration in Japan. And you might remember that Commodore Perry, who's shown here in this picture, presented the Japanese with a series of gifts before they negotiated a trade agreement, and that one of the gifts was a surrender flag in case hostilities broke out. Next, we have the expansion of the United States and Russia and Qing Dynasty China over land. So it's not just that there are imperialist colonies overseas, but during this time period there are empires that expand over land, or at least nations that expand over land. Some contracted, like the Ottoman Empire. You might remember the book referred to the Ottomans as the sick man of Europe. And this map here, if you look at the key in purple, is territory lost during the first 3 quarters of the 19th century. And then in orange, territory lost from 1878 to 1913. So you see a significant contraction of the Ottoman Empire. The other big influence is the development of nationalism and new identities. And Germany, shown here on this map, during the 19th century kind of coalesces, and of course is going to become a central player on the European stage in the 20th century. So a lot of this competition and political conflict that we'll look at in a future concept here help to encourage the growth of nationalism. And the last section in this concept is about racial ideologies used to justify imperialism, and the primary example of that is social Darwinism. And during the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution in Europe, there was an increased emphasis on science, and in many cases that was used to justify political or economic desires, and social Darwinism is a good example of that. Moving to the third concept now, nationalism, revolution, and reform, we'll be looking at the development and growth and influence of Enlightenment thought, the growth of nationalism, some reformist and revolutionary movements, and new transnational ideologies. Starting with the Enlightenment. Remember, this challenged a lot of long-standing philosophies and ideas of notions of religion, government, and social relations. We kind of emphasize Locke and Rousseau as 2 examples of Enlightenment thinkers who had a big influence. And they inspired the abolitionist movement against slavery and also the feminist movement, which we'll look at more in a few slides here. Moving on to the growth of nationalism, this picture happens to be an example of nationalism in Poland, but it was spread throughout Europe and really around the world during this time period. A country that is united by nationalism could be united by any of these factors here. It could be language, religion, social customs, or simply the territory where they live. But political boundaries are going to seem to be connected to this kind of communal identity, which helps to encourage support from citizens for various actions taken by countries. Okay, so next, some reformist or revolutionary movements. There were examples of subjects challenging existing governments, such as the Wahhabis in the Ottoman Empire. Remember, Wahhabi Islam is sort of a return to the more pure form of Islam, and there was some concern that the Ottomans were secularizing the country and trying to merge with Europe a little bit too much. And then, of course, we have the rebellions in the American colonies and the French Revolution as being extremely significant revolutions during this time period. And don't forget that they were motivated by Enlightenment thought and the notion of humans having rights and being able to determine for themselves their government. Some of these revolutionary movements or rebellions were anti-colonial, such as the Indian Revolt of 1857 and the Boxer Rebellion in China. Some of them were influenced by religious ideas, like the Taiping Rebellion in China, and some of them were influenced or resulted in reforms in imperialist policy, such as the Tanzimat movement in the Ottoman Empire and the self-strengthening movement in China. The last section in this concept is about transnational ideologies, political ideologies like economic liberalism, socialism, and communism, which really transcended nations and had appeal across a wide variety of places in the world, and we'll see that in the next unit with this communist movements around the world. And then we have the emerging feminist movement, and the writings of Mary Wollstonecraft was the example that we looked at. The last concept has to do with global migration, and we'll be looking at demographic changes and the causes and effects of the migration. First, demographic changes. Migration movements were largely caused by an increase in population, and that in turn was caused by improved methods of food production and medical care, which lengthened life expectancy, and also resulted in increasing urbanization. So remember, when people migrate at this time, they're generally migrating to industrial areas, which are cities, for jobs. And so a lot of this migration is motivated or caused by the economic changes of industrialization. So some of the causes of migration. In many cases, the movement was voluntary. In some cases, as the picture you see here, it was coerced migration, and we looked at indentured servitude, where you have a debt that you pay off through work. And then there was seasonal migration. On this map, we see Japanese migration to agricultural communities in the Pacific, and they would work at certain times for crops and then return home. And finally, the effects of migration. Again, those new roles for women, which contributes to the feminist movement. The development of ethnic enclaves, like this picture of Chinatown in San Francisco. And in some cases, governments developed ethnic prejudices. And there's an example of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was passed by the United States in the 19th century to limit Chinese immigration. So here's the Unit 5 visual summary. We have industrialization and global integration, 1750 to 1900. And it's really the causes and effects of these four main features of the unit: industrialization, imperialism, nationalism and revolution, and migration. That's the Unit 5 concept overview. Happy studying!